commerce, to 3D printing someday, and many other different things that are expanding the electronic footprint of everything we do, with consequences both for energy, for climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and for national security, as we learned quickly with Colonial Pipeline. So today's event we'll look at some of these issues. We're going to consider who will be the biggest winners and who might be the most disadvantaged by the energy transition as it gains speed. And I'm going to just start out to level set with a few statistics. First one, the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, their forecast shows that electricity could become the world's central energy carrier, rising from about 20% today to 50% by 2050. The recent report released by the International Energy Agency, IEA, in its new net zero scenario, suggests that we might have no requirement for new oil and gas fields. That was a big change for the IEA. And anyway, the point is, when you look at some of these scenarios and the Princeton Net Zero America study and other studies of quite interest, basically the landscape for world's energy markets is changing. And I think that change is going to be dramatic. It's going to create some new opportunities, but it's also potentially going to create some stranded assets. And tonight we're going to have the distinct pleasure of discussing this topic with a very distinguished panel. We have three speakers: Dr. Elizabeth Losos, who's a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute at Duke University; Chris Sternberg, who's general manager of Shell Power Digital Core, working in AI and other kinds of digital applications; and then Shivenda Bose, who is a consultant to the World Bank and IFC, based in India. A couple more statistics. Over 100 national governments in 800 cities have set or are considering setting net zero carbon emission targets. US President Biden announced that the United States will seek to achieve a 50 to 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2005 levels as our immediate goal, and that we hope to reach a zero emissions economy by 2050. When we think about that in geopolitical security terms, very interesting to think about what a electrified global economy would mean. In today's world, when oil is king, we have strategic stocks of oil that are being held both here in the United States and in other countries. But when we think about this highly electrified, digitized global economy, we're going to have to think about how do you build strategic resilience for national grids and cross-country networks, like the European electricity grid or expected ASEAN grid. So when you're having electricity connections that go across borders. And in that world, I would posit, and we'll see what the panel thinks, that countries that have superior technologies in cyber protection, electricity storage, and other kinds of electricity reserve systems, countries that have strong capabilities and facilities in metals processing and recycling, top technologies in long distance transmission, which here in the United States will be needed to really tap renewables, and clean energy, investing in clean energy. Those countries that dominate in those fields, in my opinion, are going to have sort of rising power as the energy transition accelerates. And human capital and ingenuity, rather than geological resources, could bring more security and resilience than what we've seen in the past. So what's coming in national R&D programs? What will the this level of the post-COVID economic stimulus mean in terms of competitiveness in some of these areas that I'm speaking about? Does, like, as maybe suggested in the chat, does China win because they have a national industrial policy? Can the United States implement a national industrial policy? Is the European Battery Initiative going to be a successful European-wide industrial policy? And how many of these technologies are dual use? So could give asymmetric power in military security terms, and where will be the biggest bets? So lots to discover, lot to discuss. We look forward to your questions when we get to that part of the program. But to get us started, I'd like to ask Dr. Losos to tell us about an important element to this whole process, which is, where's the funding for all these kinds of changes we're discussing going to come from? China has their Belt and Road Initiative that's been a major funder of renewable energy in a variety of places in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia. But China's also a major funder of brown industries like cement and thermal coal generation. How do you see China faring in the energy transition, and what role will their finance play?
Thank you, Amy, and thanks for the introduction and all. Very interesting way of setting the stage, and big congratulations for your new book. Very exciting. I will recommend it to everybody here. So that's a big question you asked, and it can be taken a lot of ways. So let me just pick a couple of sort of high-level comments to get us started and sort of set the stage. As I imagine everybody here is aware, China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter at this point, and has been really for, 13 years now, 14 years, since about 2006, when it surpassed the United States, which is the second largest emitter. And actually, it recently came out that in 2019, China actually began emitting as much greenhouse gases as the entire rest of the developed world. So it's quite daunting. And really what that says is, if you don't focus on what's happening, especially in China and the US, you're not going to be able to reach this transition and decarbonization. Now, per capita, of course, it's a different story. The US is by far leading the pack. But even there, China's almost caught up with the EU, and has even surpassed the UK. So last year, China has been talking for a while, but last year, President Xi committed to much stronger nationally determined contributions of their greenhouse gas emissions, and with committing to peak their emissions by 2030 and have net zero by 2060, which is great and was very exciting when this came out. There's a lot of skepticism whether they will meet it, and even that is not going to be enough to get us to where we're going to need to go if we want to keep global warming, temperature warming, to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So sort of stepping back, where do we see China on its own transition and trying to reach this commitment that they've made? So there are some good signs. China has, just in the last year, between 2020 and 2019, they've doubled the construction of new wind and solar plants within China, and they now are essentially constructing roughly equal amounts of wind, solar, and thermal plants as far as the amount of energy produced at this point. And taking it from sort of a larger, more historical political perspective, China has a pretty good record, at least in the last couple decades, of setting targets, announcing them, environmental targets, and then meeting them. They do this in a different way than in the United States. The United States, we have a very rules-based system. We legislate, regulate, and try to meet our targets that way. China does this more through their campaigns. And I'm not going to go into all this right now, but if this is something that's of interest, we can discuss whether this current focus in campaigns is likely to succeed. On the downside, the less optimistic side, despite all of what I just said, they are still building a lot of, especially coal plants, and they have, especially the last several years, decommissioned quite a few plants, but most of those are in urban areas where they were creating a huge amount of not only air pollution, but potential political unrest, which is really one of the driving forces behind all of this reduction in coal, is trying to keep the population from having political unrest from air pollution, frankly. There's also very strong coal lobby in China, as there is in the US, and we know here in the US what the implications of that are. But just in the current moment, there is this hope, and maybe we will want to talk about this more, but John Kerry, the emissary of the US, really feels like he has a good sparring partner in China and wants to remove it from all of the other very tense geopolitical situation issues that the US and the China are dealing with. China does not seem to want to do that. They want to sort of keep this all as a package, which will make a lot of these issues much harder to deal with. So that's just kind of a quick landscape of China domestically. The second point, not unrelated, is overseas energy finance. So where is that going? Where's the money coming from, et cetera? Now, these the Paris Treaty targets are only on territorial emissions, and they don't include how a country's trade, investments, imports, exports are going to affect the greenhouse gas emissions of other countries, or the carbon emissions. And in fact, this is actually, in the case of China, enormous in both directions, but in particular, the investments, whether they're loans or to a smaller degree, grants or assistance in energy projects, has a huge implication, as Amy said, both positive and negative in many countries around the world, especially lower and lower middle income and even upper middle income countries. And many of you probably have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. Amy introduced it. It was announced or launched in 2013. Initially, it was meant to connect the world back to China through investments primarily in infrastructure, energy, transportation, telecommunications, water, but energy being the largest single Belt and Road investments. And it was through Central Europe back to Asia, into Africa, and eventually the Latin America got pulled into the Belt and Road Initiative as well. And the Belt and Road Initiative was, at the time, and really remains, the largest infrastructure initiative in the world, affecting the world, and really dwarfed what was going on even through the multilateral development banks like the World Bank as far as investments. And then China also used some of its other areas, such as it set up a new multilateral development bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that sort of complements the Belt and Road. But the Belt and Road Initiative is spending primarily money through China's two policy banks, the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. And as I said, we're by far sort of dwarfing all other investments in the energy infrastructure around the world. Now, excuse me, now the really critical thing when you get back to climate and decarbonization, and climate is the sort of end goal that I'm thinking about most here, is that the scale of these investments were such that a study from Tsinghua University a couple of years ago showed that even if China and the US and all the other major emitters were to reach all of their nationally determined contributions, and the Belt and Road, 126 Belt and Road countries continued their business as usual, primarily with these investments from China, it would likely, just with a business as usual scenario, the world would likely reach 3 degrees of warming by 2050. And in some of the really less conservative scenarios, it could go upwards of 4 degrees. And the point here, the critical point, is that we can focus on the US and China and the other developed world and larger emitters. But if we don't think about these other countries, we're really losing sight of the end game. So where do we stand with China and their overseas investments and developments? The good news is that President Xi has really announced and strongly gotten behind a green belt and road, with the idea that they're trying to help develop what China calls ecological civilization, and really promote things like solar and wind and other sorts of investments which will promote green policies. This has been part of the Belt and Road from the beginning, but really started to be highlighted in 2017 and doubled down in 2019 with the second Belt and Road Forum. And there are some indications that this has had some traction. The renewable energy investments went from 38% of the Belt and Road energy portfolio in 29 to 57% last year. So overall it dropped, but all the investments dropped, but renewables remain a larger portion of this. But that said, the reality is there's a big divide between what the government is saying up here and what's happening on the ground. And in fact, China is still funding coal plants. They have, from 2000 to 2019, about 22% of all the energy investments have been in coal. They continue to fund coal. It is now, in this last year, Japan and South Korea, the last two country sponsors of coal loans, have now at least stopped lending or committed to quickly stop lending. We haven't seen that actually happen, particularly with Japan, but they do seem to be on their way out. China has not committed to that, and that's a big issue. And ultimately, if we're going to reach these climate goals, that has to happen. So that's sort of setting the stage, at least from the climate perspective of the energy investments. The last point I want to bring in is talking about the current moment. We're actually in this really interesting moment. I think of it almost as a potential inflection point due to this interesting confluence of 3 different events happening that all are coming together at this moment. The first one had been building gradually, and that is, despite what I have been telling you and what I think is covered largely in the press, the Belt and Road investments, energy investments by China through the 2 Chinese policy banks, have dropped off tremendously even before COVID started. Between 2016 and 2019, the amount of investments dropped by almost 95%, which is extraordinary and really not very well. I think folks are still thinking about the Belt and Road of 2016, 27, even 2018. So, and why that happened is several reasons likely. The Belt and Road was a convenient initiative of China. China didn't develop it as a big policy going forward. It was essentially a small policy around maritime investments that had traction, and suddenly it became the largest foreign policy effort of the country. But and it was for economic reasons, but it also was for geopolitical soft power. And in the last couple of years, the domestic economy of China has changed. There's a lot of trade wars. The situation has changed since 2013. So economically, all these investments initially pushing fast loans out quickly no longer became popular. They were more interested in those investments that had really a better rate of return and fewer bad loans. But also they started to get a bad reputation from some really, some bad loans. And because of that, they sort of pulled back, because if they're getting a negative reputation from the Belt and Road, that sort of goes against the whole purpose, or one of the important purposes. So it had already dropped off quite a bit, and China had already started talking about moving towards quality infrastructure, which means loans that are essentially less risky. The second is, of course, COVID. There was a bigger drop with COVID, and now there's a focus on building back better, green recovery, which is agreed upon by essentially every sector and every major force in the world. But whether that actually happens, whether the money is put into these countries, especially in upper middle income countries and lower income countries, is middle and lower income countries is still a big question mark. And the last issue is Joe Biden and the US have completely turned things around on this, and creating both an opportunity for collaboration, but also some pretty serious competition in the renewable energy space. And so I think I will stop there and pick up some of these other points maybe later. But back to you, Amy.
Yeah, one last question for you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
What should the United States be doing in sort of the, international finance area? I mean, it seems like the Biden administration has made some efforts to take a bigger role. How do you see that playing forward?
Well, the US clearly wants to, and if you read the rhetoric, they put out something called a climate finance plan, which is a lengthy plan on how the US is going to engage. Whether we do and how big we get in, we'll see. But the energy is behind it, and they put the right people in the right places in the government. But just quickly, the ways they can do it, the sort of obvious way to sort of bring in the US private sector is through entities like the Development Finance Corporation, which is the new version of OPIC. This is actually the Trump administration kind of realigned it and renamed OPIC to DFC. And unfortunately, they just didn't actually fund it properly and empower it to do much. And so now the Biden administration is taking it and running with it, and they've actually set a goal of a 40% by 2040 to have the whole portfolio carbon neutral, including the pre-existing projects, which there's quite a lot of fossil fuel projects in the current portfolio, particularly from the last couple of years of the Trump administration. And then, hand in hand with that is through USAID, which also, and obviously grants. But then there's some other, maybe more other ways that one doesn't immediately think of it. One is the US has a lot of influence in all the multilateral development banks, and getting these banks not only to focus in, but also make more money available for this green recovery for countries that are really struggling right now and need this infrastructure and need to be able to do green transition, which I assume we'll be talking more about soon. The other is, of course, working in coalitions. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. We're already well aligned with the EU, which is well ahead of the US with their Green Deal, and South Korea with their Green New Deal. But there's this interesting opportunity to sort of mobilize the Quad, which is Japan and Australia and India, and with a strong emphasis behind this transition and energy policy and of course climate. And I think actually part of the early work on the Quad is why Japan is feeling really sort of pushed into stopping their coal loans. And then there's other potential tools we could use, like debt for climate swaps, or trying to encourage China to do debt for climate swaps, or carbon tax and carbon border adjustments. So there are lots of financial instruments that we can either try to promote domestically or try and encourage more on an international scale.
Great. Okay, let's switch to another very important part of the world when it comes to energy transition and climate change, and that's India. Dr. Bose, important emerging economy, giant energy footprint. The Indian government has tried to prioritize solar in recent years, but its public funding is still targeting coal, even though plants are not running at full capacity. Where does India stand in the future of energy geopolitics? Important oil importer today. Do you see that changing over time?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, I think even the actual situation on the ground in India looks much better than even the policies they're looking for. Because there are a few things are happening. First one, I'd like to just say overall picture a little bit, then I'll come to the specifics. India roughly uses 1,000 million tons of oil equivalent of energy, and out of that, roughly 430 or 450 is coal, and then 270 is oil. The majority goes in coal, obviously in the industrial usage. Steel, and some of the industrial usage, but it also fuels roughly 204 gigawatt of coal, generating peak load of around 160 gigawatt from the coal only. Overall peak of India is now stands of around 200 gigawatt with around 382 gigawatt of overall installed capacity. Now, coming back to what is happening, one good thing is happening, that cost of renewable in India is dropping significantly every year. And if you see last 3 consecutive years, that investment in renewable is up, and we are getting more than 10% year-on-year growth. And from 2017 onwards, no new coal plant have been planned or announced or approved by government of India. From 2017 onwards, this stopped. Whatever is still is being financed, which is planned and approved, which is 56 gigawatt in the pipeline, but that's planned before 2017. But this is also against, by 2023, 26 gigawatt is scheduled to retire, which is 40 years old, and another 20 gigawatts we are expecting by 2030 to retire. So overall stand is that India's coal capacity more or less will go around 215 gigawatt and not more. And so this is the plus and minus. So we are getting a net of around 10 gigawatt. But the good part is that rest of things, government is not planning any of the renewable, any of the coal anymore. And there are infrastructural changes are happening, like the power market has come up. We have designed the day-ahead power market to get the resource adequacy issue. We are getting the real-time power market to balance the renewable and come up, and the ancillary power market is being rolled out. So, and also the regional connectivity. So one sun, one world, one grid is taken up by government over there. And so already the regional connectivity established between India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and where the transactions are happening. And this is, people are extending to the Myanmar and this to the Thailand and others. And we are already talking about the connection between Middle East, Gulf, and in Indian subcontinent, so that the regional connectivity will take the renewable from the desert, and that sun never sets off. So that peak is different and use of renewable energy. So that regional connectivity and regional market is being worked upon. Now, one thing is, again, I see really important that what is happening last few years, a lot of renewable also is changing. We are expecting now getting a push in the floating solar. Now that's no land acquisition, and more than 3,700 large reservoirs and floating solar is starting. The hydros are being renovated over there, so no new large hydros, but the renovation is happening, and this is the combination of these old reservoirs, upgradation, and the floating solar. So there's giving and the rooftop program, which is now actually taking off. Last few years, we have seen gigawatts of rooftop getting added up. We consider that 250 million consumers of electricity over there, and even a 1 kilowatt of rooftop, that program goes off. From the bottom level, we expect a lot of push is coming up. So on an average, coming back to this, on the electricity sector, the power market, infrastructure, and obviously the battery is now coming up which is to support the peak. So no new coal is required for the development, where the renewable plus battery can help the evening peak over there, and the existing one will take care of the night and the eventualities. So we don't see even the emissions from the sector is going up, rather is coming down. Over the time, it is already started happening, and it will continue the journey. And probably we'll get the net zero in terms of power sector much before than anticipated, just because of economic reason. Efficiency of renewable is going up, and the cost is coming down, and the cost of battery is also coming down. So we see a large benefit over there. Second portion on the on the energy transition on the electric vehicles, and there is also court has ordered, Green Tribunal has ordered, no new, actually the buses, city buses can be diesel basically. So it has to be primarily by EV, and that's happening. And there, interestingly, I know the city of Ahmedabad municipality has put their own 22 megawatt wind power plant to actually power their buses. So we see a lot of synergy between renewable energy and EV is coming up. In last 1 year, 64 new manufacturers of two-wheelers have come up, which is there are 7 new companies have started launching their EV, and we are expecting 20 more companies to join on the EV generations, including the logistical fleet. So both of the things, even on the railways, Indian Railways, which is the largest consumer of diesel, which is 3 billion liters of diesel a year, they have already taken a program on the rooftop and the fencing, solar fencing along the railway tracks and the storage to convert there to net zero. It is, the good part is that in India, net zero is basically economically viable. So on the question is finance, I'll come to that, but that transition already happened. There are airports in India, in southern India, is fully operational by solar roof. So those have started over there, and as well as integration things have started. Then and this is also connected by the smart meter program. Already 10 million smart meter has been implemented, and there's a plan to cover the entire country by smart meter, which will enable the transition, digital transition, and the renewable energy because of the different time of the tariff and competitive market will come in. So we see the lot of changing models over there. We very vehicle to grid, smart grid, those things will coming up. Now, the thing is that what is the overall impact on this? Now, this is an interesting point where India actually gaining a lot. And that's why I think, the transition in India can come much before than even the government, because business is driving that today. The thing is that India imports today, this year, almost $184 billion of energy import only, which is a significant amount. Now, the largest part of these, around $114 billion, is on oil, and rest is the energy coal. Now, with the renewable and electric vehicle, this is set to come down. When it comes down, there are two aspects why it will come down on the electric vehicle sector and the power sector. Basically, it makes sense economic. I mean, running a car on electric is cheaper now over here. So because the oil is very costly over here. So things are driving down, and it will impact the current account deficit situation. Just think about that. We save $10 billion in import. That does mean, I put $16 billion because GDP investment to GDP ratio in India is 1.6. So I generate $16 billion of GDP over here. And that helps me in the employment generation and boosting the production of electric vehicles, as well as on the PV and battery in India. So government has just put the production linked incentive last few weeks for battery. So things are moving towards this, ecosystem is actually moving towards helping this transition over there. The point is that if I gain $10 billion, somebody else bound to lose $10 billion. So that's where the geopolitics will start occurring. And the second thing is important for India, because India doesn't have the, technology. So even the car manufacturing technology, the engine technology, or even the, the thermal power turbine. So though we manufacture turbine here in India, this is BHEL is licensed by Alstom. And then we are talking about the cars. They are licensed by mostly the European manufacturers. Now the thing is that the moment electric vehicle and the renewable gets over in India, there's a lot of money flow. So in terms of technology payment, that is going to reduce. So that's the multiple, and the economic income generations in the country is going to be up. So definitely this is going to gain, but obviously then the other part, I mean, who are actually the traditionally last 50, 60 years, people are gaining money, that money is going to be changed. So that's where it stands as on date over there. And finally is that just I'll stop here and then ask question, specific question, you can comment this. There are the two impediment issues in the whole transition. The biggest issue, I think, as a country is facing, and this is the, which is the legacy investment in auto, OEMs. They have invested in the large, roughly, on their industrial infrastructure for automobiles. It is one of the largest after China. And second portion is that even on the legacy thermal power plants, because they are the 20 years, 30 years long gestation projects, and we cannot just throw them up. I mean, technically, we can throw them up and put renewable and do this and battery. But the thing is that investment goes bad in services that will create a financial failure in the financial system failure. So definitely that investment, how do we treat the legacy investment? Because 200 gigawatt of investment coal is not a small money for Indian country like India. So even I was working on Vietnam and Cambodia also, the issue is same. The legacy investment handling is the one. How do we handle that? That's going to be, so it's a financial structure, but we need to do it this. So this is one side of this, and I think that the way Vietnam, Uzbekistan, Cambodia is growing in last years, Vietnam just alone put more than around 10 gigawatt of solar in 1 year, compared to the peak load of around 24 gigawatts. So that's a significant amount of changes are happening. And same as Uzbekistan, 2 years back it was nothing. Now 400 megawatt just got sanctioned last week. So it is going very fast, changing is fast. But the thing is that it has to fuel two things. Where is the supply of PV and supply of battery? Reliable, efficient, these things. So if we can create the supply chain a little bit better and the cost will come down, I think energy transition looks for implementers like us, it looks much better than it is even in the policies. So I'll stop here. Ask for the specific questions. We can get to it.
Very good. Okay, so let's switch gears now. We're going to go to Chris Sternberg. So what is electrification going to mean for, let's move away from the national picture of these big economies, and what's it going to mean for big oil incumbents like Shell? How are they going to transform? And I feel I have to add an added question to that, especially given your expertise in the recent event with Colonial Pipeline. Don't need you to comment on Colonial, but can you give us a little hint on how do you think the energy industry is going to think about cybersecurity going forward?
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it, and to the YPE team for inviting me. Elizabeth covering China in great detail, and Shivendu covering India in great detail. That covers about 3 billion people on the planet, which leaves me with about 5 to talk about here in terms of our oil and gas companies. And I think that the topic is extremely broad, right? The electrification, how's it going to impact oil and gas companies? And overall, the winners and losers for decarbonization, right? So really going back to just that population bit, like the way things have worked for oil and gas companies for the last 100 years has been pretty similar, right? As population increases, demand for oil and gas increases. It was pretty predictable. And right now we're entering a phase of great unpredictability in terms of what's happening to the customer base of oil and gas companies. And markets hate unpredictability. So this is an enormous challenge. And also in terms of winners and losers, from a geopolitical point of view, oil and gas moves around. It's denominated in US dollars. So US dollars are essentially, funding a lot of the activity of the petrostates. So destabilizing them by losing some of this income is going to be a really interesting challenge as well, just from a geopolitical point of view. But specifically for oil and gas companies, what they're all experiencing is long-term demand destruction in transport fuels. And as a result of that, it's an existential crisis for them. Is like, how do you replace the customer base, the relationships that you have, and your business model with a new business model that deals with electrification? And the electrification parts that we're going after, specifically from the industry that I'm involved in, are really the low-hanging fruits of this whole question, right? Which is transport fuel and electrification from gas, from power plants. We're really not even talking about touching some of the more difficult questions of decarbonization on cement or steel or agriculture. We're really still in the very beginning stages of this, focused on what does it mean to transition from a transportation fuel that's hydrocarbon based, highly predictable supply chain with ratable volumes going through it all the time, to a very unpredictable supply chain with the feedstocks changing, the mix of those changing from natural gas and coal and nuclear to renewables and gas, and those markets and the prices for developing those resources are not as predictable as developing a new oil field or a new gas field. The cost curves of what's happening with those are dramatically changing over time. If somebody would have told you what the cost of a battery was 5 years ago and what it is today, you can throw Moore's law out the window. The drop has just been extremely dramatic. So with that level of uncertainty, how do you go ahead and build and deploy enormous transitions of infrastructure? And with infrastructure that's supposed to have a service life of 20 years or 30 years, without knowing whatsoever what the long-term cost curve and value curve of what that's going to be. It makes it extremely difficult as a company to deploy capital in a predictable way, which is what investors and markets want. But That being said, the incumbents, definitely have a number of strengths that they can leverage that are actually quite positive for the overall industry because of their expertise. They obviously operate an enormous amount of mobility infrastructure today. So the ability to put in charge posts in petrol stations around the world, support that with local storage capability and rooftop solar. They actually have the infrastructure. They understand people are used to it. It's a normal consumer pattern, and they have brands that are known for transport. So they actually have a right to play in this overall ecosystem of mobility. Oil and gas companies are essentially giant construction companies to begin with, and they're very good at complex engineering and deploying things at incredible scale. One of my favorite things watching over the last 10, 15 years has been the whole LNG industry, where it used to cost billions of dollars to build liquefaction and gasification, and getting the permits to do that. It was an extremely complex financial transaction. Today, now they actually have built vessels that do both liquefaction and gasification on the vessel itself. So you can float these things around to wherever the actual supply and demand balance allows. An incredible deployment of technology and innovation in a really short period of time. And the capital associated with that, it's capable of large companies that have the ability to do that. Oil and gas companies essentially, have seen this energy transition coming at them much longer than you may think. And many of the investments that were made in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s were really in gas. And they understood that this was going to be a transition fuel before we found the right mix and the right capability of combining new technologies in terms of renewables in the overall mix. So they've started on this path a long time ago, and they'll continue on that path. And they see that bridge as a way of being able to generate enough capital to continue to find the operating model as we wait to see what the cost drive downs are occurring on the rest of it. And let's be clear, they have the balance sheet in order to deal with not only the cost uncertainty of being able to fund the capital requirements for it, but also the business model uncertainty. The solar coaster days of the early part of the 2020 or from now back 20 years, we saw the whole rapid change in the cost curve for that, in the financing model for solar being loans to lease to now people want to own everything themselves. So we see definitely the whole thing kind of changing, and having the balance sheet to understand how to find the right business model is certainly a capability that some of the larger companies, incumbents, not only in oil and gas, but also the rest of the owners of the current infrastructure of energy. And then, finally, I think the most interesting point of what makes this such an interesting question, an interesting topic for me as well, is that the supply chain itself is dramatically different than the hydrocarbon supply chain. And it's also quite different from the way it was operating just a few years ago to the way it's operating today. It used to be, hey, let's generate a bunch of electrons, we'll send them to you, we'll send you a bill. And that was the extent of how the supply chain operated. And now we're seeing this incredible shift of decentralization of generation, even localization of generation, and the formation of microgrids and somewhat islanding capabilities and participation in the overall supply-demand balance of being a two-way transaction. And not only is it a two-way engineering grid of moving power to one location or reintroducing it back into the grid, we also have introduced this enormous ability to connect all of these devices. So anything from your heat pump to your thermostat to geothermal capabilities to rooftop solar, all sorts of distributed energy resource, grid edge resources. every single one of these devices generates data, and they generate telemetry of how they're operating. We have smart meters now where we didn't have them before. You used to have someone come by and read the meter, and you'd be lucky if the utility got an actual real reading of what the home was actually consuming once a month or once a year. Now we get it every 5 minutes. And quite frankly, the industry isn't really ready for this deluge of data, and they're drowning in it. And on top of that, the network capability of those devices, you have to bring that data back to a central location. So the cost structure of how that's being done, graduating from 3G to 4G to now 5G, some cases it costs more to collect the data than the amount of profit you could potentially make on a given meter. So how do you actually figure out what is the proper cost structure for collecting all this data? Then you have to analyze all this data. And bringing all that data to the cloud requires massive compute power, and being able to understand how to write your algorithms and your learning algorithms to deploy that capital or that data in such a way that it creates new business models, for not only for oil and gas companies, but for participants in the industry. So I'll set aside the cybersecurity issues of all those devices for a second and kind of really talk about what the energy transition kind of means, I think, kind of going forward, in the sense that this data is actually going to become, or if it hasn't already become, more valuable than the electrons themselves being sold to the end user. If you look at the end-to-end energy supply chain, you have the generation part and you have the usage part, then you have the poles and wires and the transmission parts in the middle. I think you'll see the traditional utilities gravitate towards operating the poles and wires in the middle, and then I think you'll see just an enormous diversity of companies coming in to either do the generation part or do the sales part to retailers and consumers. And where this really comes to fruition, I think, for energy companies like Shell or other large companies who are used to participating in markets and dealing with hedge risk management, is that having knowledge of real-time knowledge and telemetry from generation assets, the supply side of the equation, and having knowledge in real time of the demand side of the equation, coming from devices, coming from your Tesla, coming from your rooftop solar, those data brought together at the trading floor will allow a whole new set of strategies to be deployed by trading companies around the world. And that will allow financing to occur of more and more deployment of these assets and more deployment of collecting all this data together. And so energy companies, are capable of dealing with that sort of price risk management, supply demand risk management. And that type of risk management is going to be, I think, an enormous driver that is really going to take to the next level of deploying all these different pieces of technology necessary to do the decarbonization. There is an enormous amount of opportunity for the companies that can get to scale. And if they can get to scale, then they'll be the winners in this transition. However, there's some enormous risks, and we just saw that last week with the Colonial Pipeline situation, where ransomware was able to shut down a key artery of infrastructure. Same can be said of somebody putting a Raspberry Pi on your thermostat and being able to tap into a larger network of collection of data sets. There's an air gap reasons for nuclear power plants not to be connected to the internet, but all these devices, including your car or your phone or your refrigerator that's now connected to the internet, are all opportunities for someone with nefarious means to really come in and disrupt the whole supply chain. And let's not forget, there's going to be some losers in this energy transition, and those petrostates solely dependent on those export dollars to support their economies or support their regimes, also have a lot of these capabilities in cyber attack capability. And it's in their vested interest to elongate the timeline of petrodollars as long as possible. So it's an exciting time. It's a scary time, but it's an inevitable leap, I think, towards deploying technology and capabilities to make the planet a better place for all of us. So it's exciting. I'll leave it at that, Amy.
Okay, well, I've got some questions coming in here in the chat, and they're good ones, so I'm just going to read them verbatim like a robot because they're so good. Ian Ferguson says O Power and then Duke MEM. He's thanking everybody for their comments so far. I agree. It's been very fascinating discussion. He says he's curious to hear how countries outside the United States are handling demand side decarbonization. Is peak management going to be a major player? What about energy efficiency in places like China? Are rates like time of use being used as price signals?
Amy, we haven't heard from you. I bet you could answer that well.
Well, okay, let's talk about it. So it's a very sort of interesting landscape. You have some countries that are being very proactive, some, somewhat surprising countries. For example, Saudi Arabia has announced they want to kind of push forward in solar, and they have a hydrogen sort of ammonia project to be able to export solar energy in the form of hydrogen or ammonia. And so, it's very interesting for the sort of premier player in oil. And even Gazprom in Russia has made some investments in renewables and has sort of tried to push itself into electricity, sort of mirroring some of the global majors. So you're having sort of a different response, but then you have countries where the national oil companies are still investing billions of dollars in coal or in oil and gas research and development. Even in China, the national oil companies, even though they've gotten sort of in line behind China's net zero 2060 announcement, and you're starting to have the big national oil companies announcing that they too are going to move towards net zero goals. It's not clear yet exactly, how that's going to transpire. I think as we've been discussing on the panel, all these digital technologies are going to bring in huge efficiency gains. Yeah. And that's partly through automation, whether that's in manufacturing, whether that's in warehousing and delivery systems for e-commerce. I mean, China, of course, has been making a lot of gains in energy efficiency. I have, just see if I can try to remember it. I know the statistic. China has had I think their oil intensity is 20% what it was in 2005. Whereas for the United States, since the 70s, we've made like a 90%, we're 90% less oil intensive than we were, back during the oil crisis. So China's sort of more rapidly catching up to in energy efficiency. But a lot of these new technologies we're talking about, if e-commerce is much bigger in China than it is even in the United States, though in the United States it's been accelerated now with COVID. One of the interesting opportunities about e-commerce is, per Chris's comments, is that, a lot of the big companies are using algorithms and data. So there is no longer, there's no UPS driver who is putting a bunch of packages in the back of a truck and driving around at his leisure, turning right and then turning left based on what he'd like to do. It's all computerized. The package.
an enormous amount of difference in regulatory implications country by country. Like FERC 2222 just in the US, now those distributed energy resources can participate in markets. So the business concept of value stacking, which is essentially what things are possible in what market. In some cases, you can do time of use market. In some countries, you can't. Demand response isn't really prevalent in the UK. And so we have to get some standardization of what the value stacking things are going to be. But even in the US, you have an enormous variety of regulatory allowances of what's possible in each market. So these markets they need to open up more and more. And it's going to be a transition period but all these different types of models and technologies are possible. We just need to find the active routes to make them viable.
And indeed, to that point, California today passed new legislation that all ride-hailing vehicles need to be electrified. I forget the year, I think 2030. And so, that's like the first step, beyond doing the pricing reform to, promote DERs and some of these other structures, which you've seen in New York City and a few places. It goes beyond just the power grid itself, because it's in all these other areas of mobility and e-commerce, and which are highly oil intensive. And so if we start moving towards these efficiencies, you could really eliminate a lot of oil. We did a set of scenarios with a team at Columbia, and I did a sort of a digital advent scenario. And we found that by 2030, we could eliminate about 8.5 million barrels a day of oil demand just through these digitization type strategies and DERs and things like that. So, okay, let me go to the next question. Next question is, in the post-fossil fuel era, are there any decarbonization technology, natural resources, or commodities that are going to be critical for a countries to have geopolitical influence over other countries?
Yeah, rare earth metals.
So let's talk about rare earth metals for a little bit, because I think there's this misnomer or this misperception that all the rare earth metals are located in China, when actually it's the processing that China sort of dominates 50–60%. But not actually in the possession of the mining. And in fact, China itself had to start stockpiling rare earths because Myanmar and them got in a trade dispute, and they were concerned that their supply would get cut off. So really interesting to sort of take a little bit deeper dive into lithium and some of these other metals that materials that people are talking about, because same thing, lithium is pretty well located around the world, in Europe and in Australia. I mean, it's not just in, places that are hard to access, but yet, and it's recyclable. But the processing capacity, again, is very concentrated. So that's, I think, part of the challenge is not so much the mining itself, though there's some metals that are more rare than others, but also just the industry of it. And that kind of comes back down to answer the question, like, what country is going to have the strongest industrial policy to be the location for really processing these metals into usable form. Right now, China's really leading out of the gate, not only in processing, but also in recycling, which is going to be important. And the question is, will they be able to maintain that lead? I don't know, Elizabeth, you want to weigh in on that?
No, that's all right. I was going to weigh in on the next question.
Oh, okay. All right, let's go to the next question. Michael, are we going at 10:30 or we're stopping at 10:15?
10:30. Let's keep the good Q&A going.
Okay, because I've got some good questions here in the things. Okay, question in the chat. How do oil and gas companies survive in the business model Chris just described, where the margins will be much lower, than when back in the days when, you know, the companies used to make 17%, or so they thought they were making 17%. I could question in the last 10 years whether the companies were really actually making that 17%. But, you know, there have been times when the oil rents were, you know, quite substantial. You know, what's the path forward? Chris, that one's to you.
That's for you, Chris.
Yeah, so I think I kind of alluded to it a little bit in my discussion, which may be surprised, may not be surprised to a lot of you, but a lot of the profits from oil and gas companies have not been, you know, directly coming from pulling stuff out of the ground and selling it. It's been from the trading activity associated around it, and having deep knowledge of the physical supply chain and being able to take positions either in the forward markets or in different components of the supply chain, and understanding the different relationships between the prices as things move through the supply chain. And like, you know, a barrel of oil may trade hands 50, 70 times before it's actually consumed. I think in the power space, you're going to see the exact same thing, where the data itself, the knowledge of when a market is a potential spike, you know, and algorithmic trading will be the tool that will be used to go in and capture, you know, 0.5 of a cent margin on an actual trade, whereas you used to get a back-to-back dollar a barrel trade, you know, in the old days of oil. And it has to be done, I think, electronically and algorithmically. And I think you're going to see just enormous amounts of capital being thrown at finding ways to take micro movements in price moves and be able to turn those into profits to support the companies.
You know, we've already seen that with the sort of Tesla Australia projects where,
Absolutely.
you know, it's like how many, you know, they're trying to push to go to 1 second pricing, you know, from 1 minute pricing down from 5 minute pricing. So absolutely very interesting new area. Okay, switching gears. We have a good question from Ashwarya. Do you think Africa is missing an opportunity for the West? Is a missed opportunity for the West from the point of view of decarbonization? Because so much of the clean energy investment there and nuclear energy investment there has come from China and Russia.
I'll take that, unless Shubhendu, if you want to step in at all, feel free to step in at any point. So that question it's like there's a pie, and it's either the West or China and Russia. And I don't think, at least in Africa, I don't think China and Russia have crowded out Western investments. I think the West just hasn't shown up to really make those investments. And actually now, and I'm mostly talking from my China perspective. I haven't followed Russia so much, but right now, China is actually, as I alluded to before, really decreasing its energy investments in Africa. And I think we'll find out in, sometime later this year, they do a 3-year meeting called FOCAC, where they bring all these African countries together, and China sort of announces what it's going to fund. And the thought is that there's actually not going to be much in the large scale energy sector. It'll be much smaller, and a bigger sort of pivot to digital, all sorts of digital investments, and health, which is a little bit more on the kind of soft power, helping them get vaccines and other health related, especially COVID related. So there'll be an opportunity. There's a huge need for these investments in Africa. And they, you know, if the West wants in on clean energy, there's plenty of opportunities in the past, but definitely moving forward. I think there'll be even more openings.
Okay.
I was just going to say,
ahead.
I saw Shubhendu's mic go off for a second there. Did you want to chime in, Shubhendu? Nope, no pressure. Okay.
I think, you know, As for the World Bank group goes, I think we are pretty active in the African market, and as we speak, we are investing projects in Malawi, and I can talk about the South Africa and Kenya, and pretty much almost in the all African region. Both IFC and World Bank is working on that. And as you know, I think the history of electrification or the renewable energy trends, whatever, it mimics the same pattern which over in the 90s and now. So it is the energy access that spurs the economy, and then spurs the demand growth, and then the large investments. So Africa is going through that cycle, and you are right that the private investment, except from the multilateral organization, is still a challenge. But yes, we are working towards to solve this and attract investment, create the macroeconomic scenario. And obviously the credit issues, there are lots to actually, we have to give the investors the safety. So we are working towards this, and it's not a simple problem. But yeah, no specific solution, but we are trying to solve this. We are working on that.
So Sang Yang, why don't you ask your question since you're here on screen?
You mean the later question?
Yeah, your related question on OPEC.
Yeah, so I was wondering, so are there any countries that oil companies are newly focusing on? And I guess they were primarily focused on the OPEC countries, but now is it like switching to another like specific country, or is it becoming like more kind of localized like strategy?
Chris, you want to take that?
So I think the shift in OPEC was a supplier of feedstock, which was generally like, how do we get the barrels that we need to break into the subcomponents that we were going to sell out. The energy companies now are really focused on trying to build the demand side of the equation. And so it's really on the populations, not just of OPEC countries, but of all countries, this idea of really forming a relationship with the brand, with the consumer of energy, and being less of a wholesale distributor of it, or owning that part of the supply chain, but really trying to own more of the relationship with the demand side, the idea of the prosumer. And the idea that those prosumers will also participate in markets, even in small ways, and such as like community solar or something of that sort. And so I think their focus is really on, instead of just a few countries, a few transactional things to look at, their lens is just so much wider now, and using technology as a way to actually create those relationships, social media to create those relationships, establish those relationships. And they see that as the way of establishing their brand. And it's all about getting to scale and taking all the micro fragments of the industry and tying them together at scale is really what they're going after. So it's different in the sense that the feedstocks going forward aren't going to be limited to a few of these petrostates. They're actually going to be not only the users of the power, but actually the consumers and the distributors and the producers of the power. Everything's being interrelated.
Okay, I have one last question. So we're starting to get to time here, and I want to give Michael a chance to do a wrap up. We have I have another question. Anyway, we have a question about the petrostates, and the question from Steve. Steve, you want to ask your own question? Go ahead.
Sure, I'd love to ask my own question. Yeah, so like, I think I've heard this thing before where Saudi Arabia came out and said, "Oh, we're going to drill the last barrel of oil on the planet Earth," right? And because I think they're saying that it's so cheap that you can do it cheaper there in many other petrol states as well, which makes it feel like, oh, they could be competitive for a long time, even if oil is declining and such. But my understanding is that that's their actual like economic cost, but then there's like a higher social cost because they've basically given these oil rents or pledged these oil rents to fund their budget and like handouts to a lot of the citizens. And so like as we see this transition play out, like those rents are drying up, which could potentially create like a political nightmare if you just yank that rug out from under those pledged rents. And I'm just curious if anyone on the panel has a thought on like how do they approach that? Because it seems to me like a really sticky situation.
Well, let me make you feel even more nervous about it. One of the ways the countries are approaching that problem is they're offering sovereign bonds and borrowing to maintain their budgets. I mean, to the tunes of billions and billions of dollars. So one of the reasons why you saw the Trump administration intervene in the oil markets when it looked like there was going to be a Saudi-Russian price war at the start of COVID. You know, people thought it was all about the shale sector, but it really, in my view, was not about that, having talked to the team. It really was about the concern that Ecuador was going to default on its loans, and Pemex had a giant amount of loans coming up. They had $6 billion they had to repay in 2020. And I think it's 2024, they have another 20 billion or something that comes due. And so there is this structural challenge, you know, that the Fed and central banks and the IMF and others have to look at, which is if the energy transition accelerates, and as it accelerates, you know, what happens to a country like Chad? You know, I think somebody's trying to put pressure on Glencore to forgive Chad's oil for dollars loan program, right? So you have these countries that have borrowed, or, you know, issued these bonds. And if the oil price doesn't stay up, that is going to be a big problem. And that is currently how they're paying for the social programs. And they're hoping, in some cases, they're hoping that their sovereign wealth fund will invest properly and that will carry through the day. And that might be true in some countries. But the long-term picture, you know, for years, these countries were able to tell their populations, whether that was Iraq or Venezuela, someplace else, that they should just be patient because we're going to get back to the point where we've run out of oil everywhere else. And we're going to be sitting pretty again with very high oil prices. And I think now, you know, if you're educated elite in a lot of these countries, you can see that's not going to happen. Not going to happen, A, because of shale. So we're not going to really ever get to a point again, I don't think. It doesn't matter how conservative the shale producers are playing today. If the price of oil went way up suddenly, you know, you'd have a lot of money that could come back into the shale if need be. But then the flip side is you have all these technologies eliminating demand for oil. You have the shift to electricity as a carrier. You have the potential of natural gas taking some markets. And then you have just, you know, energy efficiency and demand saving. So, you know, the prospects for there being another 10-year period or 5-year period of elevated oil prices like we saw, you know, in the 2010s, that's not likely to happen again. Populations are realizing that. And that's why I think you see things like 3 months where young people in Iraq just came out on the streets and stayed on the streets because they didn't see what their possible future could be, right? And it is going to be very hard. It's going to be, I think, a challenge. You're going to see more fragile states. You think about, I mean, I think that the G20 is going to have to consider this because in the following way, we just can't have multiple Venezuelans. I mean, the tragedy of what's happened in Venezuela is just unbelievable, but on a humanitarian basis. And so I do think it's going to take more planning and thought. And I don't see us accelerating the actions that need to be taken.
There's only one Norway, right? And they all point to that as a model, and their government is quite different than the rest of these countries we're talking about.
Well, and let me point out, you know, state of Alaska still giving out their permanent dividend checks for, oil revenue, and their budget's being blasted up to nowheresville, partly because oil prices are down, the volumes that Alaska can produce today are down, and then they have higher human costs because of climate change, because they're an Arctic country, an Arctic state. So, so it not even in our own country, we have that problem where there are people in Alaska that need to be relocated, and who's going to pay for that? Just the same way as the island nations, have to concern themselves with their population. So it's a very tricky question. And yeah, Norway did manage it much better than everyone else. And then if you look at I guess that's not fair, but I mean, Equinor seems to be pivoting better than a lot of other companies. And then of course, Ørsted, which is European, is like the model pivot to go from being an oil and gas company to being a successful renewables company. Well,
Yeah.
Michael, I'm going to leave it to you.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Yeah, and I was just going to add on that thread too. It's really interesting to see this great pivot, as I think you started to say. And Saudi Arabia, as Steve said, really I think is doing a lot on that front. But whether they'll be able to fully change their economy around, for example, Saudi Arabia is the biggest investor, I believe, still in Lucid, which is coming to market to be the new Tesla, right, for personal electric vehicles. So, those kind of investments around the country, around the world. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Shivendu, Christopher, and Elizabeth. Thank you to all our distinguished speakers. Fascinating discussion tonight. Really cutting across everything and that we see and hear in the news and that we're thinking about, and just going a level deeper. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for coming. I thought I'd just give a real quick recap of everything we talked about. I'll do my best in a minute or less, and then give a quick plug on kind of a little bit about YPE, following up what Song Yin said as a reminder, and get you all to join for our following events. So we started by talking about how oil and gas is, its use is diminishing on the world stage. Amy laid out some great statistics. And so this, we're seeing the use, the demand side really change. And Chris talked about that as well. So there's new strategic reserves around the world as we electrify everything. So storage, right, being the new oil reserve potentially. Cybersecurity being really key as everything's electrified. And, instead of the old kinds of terrorist attacks, we'll potentially see new ones on more digital assets. Elizabeth talked a lot about, eloquently about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, used the phrase, I guess, taking what China calls their ecological civilization as they're spreading, and made a really interesting point too about the foreign direct investments and lending kind of pulling back in recent years there. And then Shivendu chimed in with the Indian perspective and talked about all the renewables and electrification that's happening there, and in particular on the electric vehicle side. Sounds like a lot of positive activity around that. And I think he highlighted some of the differences between China and India, and how the politics and the political system and economy works there, and a little bit differently. Chris talked about the national strategies and coordination to build infrastructure and batteries, and I think really brought a great perspective, from business, kind of the bottom line at the end of the day, companies needing to make money. Elizabeth talked about this as well, and others of the need to create jobs out of this opportunity, in addition to saving the climate. We talked about how the oil and gas demand is no longer so predictable, and the markets don't really like this. So we're going to see a great period of less stability in both that financial sense, but then as we kind of closed up here, from a political and popular sense too. And so that transition will be difficult to manage from a political perspective as well, and security perspective. We also talked about how some of the disputes around the world, and perhaps, we didn't get into the military side of things too much, but that rare earth metals, will play a different role, you know, and a more important role going forward, but the production thereof is really key, you know, how they're refined and produced and where they are, and the need for national strategies around that. So with that, thanks again, everybody, for coming, and thanks again to our distinguished speakers. Thanks again. Thanks also to my co-leaders that helped me put together this. I want to highlight again Steve and Songyun and Aishwarya here, and Igor. This has been a production of Young Professionals in Energy in the San Francisco Bay Area chapter. Please look us up and come to our future events. We put on about one event a month. Including one coming up here shortly in just a few weeks after the Memorial Day holiday. So we hope you'll join us again soon. And we also offer lots of resources around career development. We have a jobs board. So for those of you who are either looking to tap into this burgeoning sector or looking to make a transition, you know, please utilize us and reach out if you'd like to get involved. So thanks again and have a good night.
Right.
Thank you.